Let's talk about the Akedah, the famous 10th test with which Abraham was faced when instructed to take his son Isaac and sacrifice him atop of the mountain. You have to wonder, why on earth does God feel the need to present Abraham with this 10th test? Wasn't it enough to already subject him to so much seeming torment with all the earlier tests, not least jumping into the fires of Kasdim and other such like, which he passed with flying colors? Why does this test of the Akedah, the sacrificing of Isaac, become the all-defining test? Let's be Jewish and answer the question with a question. Why indeed do we make such a big deal about the story of the Akedah, the sacrificing of Isaac in the first instance? I mean, we reference it on Rosh Hashanah, we blow the shofar on account of it, etc. Isn't it the case that there are countless people throughout the course of history that were willing and did indeed lay down their lives for the sake of God? Do we not know the story of Hannah in the Hanukkah story, who famously said, as per the words of the Medrash, Abraham, you gave one son to God, I've given 7 sacrifices, 7 sons to God. And so we find, whether it's in Masada or in the Inquisition, when faced with the cross and the sword and told, kiss this or this kisses you, invariably people always gave up their lives. So why are we making such a big deal about the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of his son Isaac at the Akedah? The answer lies in one key word. When God instructs Abraham to take his son as a sacrifice, he actually says, nah, please. It's not a word that God uses in any other instance when it comes to the earlier tests. In this one case, God is actually imploring Abraham to please submit to this particular final test. Why? As the commentaries note, so that people will not say that there was no substance to any of the earlier tests. What does that actually mean? You see, there are different levels of sacrifice, or self-sacrifice, if you will. At a most basic level, when you choose to give up something of yourself for the sake of another, then that constitutes self-sacrifice. Isn't marriage, after all, self-sacrifice? You're taking your life, until now, all your own, and you're submitting it to somebody else. Sometimes doing a favor for another, when you extend yourself beyond your practical means for the sake of another, that's also a form of self-sacrifice. And when you dare to step out of your comfort zone for the sake of your faith, then that certainly also constitutes a form of self-sacrifice. But invariably, there's always some element of ulterior motive that is included in what is being acted upon. There's always some element of agenda within the psyche of those who are sacrificing. You do something for the sake of another or a cause, but essentially you do it because you stand to gain something. It can even be something lofty or altruistic, even giving up your life, but always with motive nonetheless. You do a favor for another because you want that person to like you. You get married because it enhances your own life. And yes, sometimes you give up your life, but that's because you anticipate some greater reward that might be beckoning elsewhere, or because of some grand statement that your own self-sacrifice might make as a result of others hearing it. Just think about Muhammad Bouazizi, who put himself on fire and kicked off the Arab Spring. Was it pure? Was it altruistic? It was self-sacrifice, but it was ulterior motive, however fine and subtle that might have been. He had an objective, and boy, did he achieve it. It's true that Abraham had earlier opportunities to demonstrate his willingness to sacrifice for God, like when he stepped into the fires of Kasdim rather than renounce his faith. But how do I know that he was doing that with pure intent? Maybe that was his Tunisia moment. Maybe that was his Abraham Spring, as it were. Maybe that was his opportunity to demonstrate to everyone else who will have heard about it, about how far one has to go for the sake of their faith, for the sake of God. So again, there will have been some element of ulterior motive, however lofty or spiritual that might have been. There's no way for me to know that other than in retrospect. And so when it comes to the story of the Akedah, there's no statement. It's the top of a mountain. No one knows, no one hears, no one is aware. And even if people thereafter become aware, if anything, they will rile, they'll condemn Abraham. They will call him a hypocrite because it was common practice to sacrifice children for pagan worship. Abraham preached against this, and now they'll argue he's gone and done the same. So ultimately, when Abraham does what he does, he knows that he stands nothing to gain and everything to lose. Thus God says, do this, please, because when you do, everyone will then know that in retrospect, everything else you did was also, without any agenda, without any ulterior motive, pure, altruistic, only because you love me and because you are absolutely committed to the tenets of your faith. And so it begs us to question ourselves when it comes to sacrifice. How far would you be willing to go for the sake of somebody else? To put the question somewhat differently, can you think of someone whom you'd be willing to give up your life for? Whose life would you look to spare in exchange for that of your own? I'm going to safely assume that if you ask most men, they'd be thinking that they'd give up their lives for their wives and certainly their children. If you ask most women, they would think, children, absolutely. Husbands, not so much. But insofar as children are concerned, we all, normal, healthy fathers and mothers, will always put them first. On one level, because they are perceived as weak and we have to do what we can to protect them. But even as that child may be older, bigger, maybe even physically stronger than us, as indeed Isaac was in relation to Abraham, we still tend to put ourselves on the line for the sake of our kids. Why? Because there is a deep, intrinsic bond that we feel towards our children. So throughout history, there are scores of people, many seemingly totally detached from their roots, who, when indeed faced with the cross and the sword, gave up their lives. Does it make sense to sacrifice for someone whom you cannot see or perceive in any tangible way? Certainly not. But on a spiritual level, their souls felt a deep bond with God that is at least as intrinsic as the relationship between parent and child. And so regardless of how detached or distant we might think ourselves to be, we have a soul which is an extension of the divine, which cannot, nor does it ever want to sever that bond. At a precise moment when one indeed feels, therefore, their whole soul essence being threatened, for no rational reason, no motive, no agenda, they are prepared to step up and give up their lives rather than sever that bond. Otherwise, there's no point to their continued existence. But the question is, where did we all draw that strength from? How is it that Jews throughout the millennia, alas, when faced with persecution, found the wherewithal to be able to give up their lives for the sake of their faith? We were created as physical entities. How do we summon the strength to negate ourselves without ulterior motive? The answer is from Abraham himself. You see, he broke the ice. He was the first. In 1954, Roger Bannister was the first person to ever run a mile in under 4 minutes. Up until that point, it was perceived as impossible. That same year, 2 other people managed to achieve the same. What changed? Was it something in the air? Was it a change in sneakers? Certainly not. It was a mental barrier which, once penetrated, enabled other people to step up and achieve it as well. Abraham managed to penetrate the barrier because inasmuch as there are psychological barriers, there are spiritual barriers. He was the first to have achieved this great feat of genuine self-sacrifice. And in so doing, he validates everything else that he had done beforehand. Hence God says, now I know, in response to this, that you are indeed God-fearing. This proves everything. And in so doing, he also opens the channels for Jews throughout the ages. Whether on Masada, whether Hannah and her 7 sons, whether Jews in the Holocaust, and many others besides, to be able to achieve the same true martyrdom, to live as a Jew and ultimately to die as a Jew. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son serves as the psychological and spiritual inspiration to Jews throughout the ages. It's a single most defining moment in history. He is the ultimate hero, and we could all learn from his life's example. Shabbat Shalom.